Hello, gardeners, and welcome to another edition of Your Gardening Week. This is the wonderful place to be on Monday where we talk about gardening and I answer your questions and we get lots of information shared back and forth. Great to see everybody already checking in. While we're waiting for people to check in and let us know where you're from, I want to start by asking you a question, just a simple question. When you're in your garden, all alone, and you notice that things aren't quite going right. Maybe there's a pest, your plants aren't growing the way you want, the weather has caused some damage. Do you stand there or sit there for a moment and think, what's going wrong? Am I the only one that has this problem? Why do I hear so much success from so many other gardeners? What am I doing wrong? Well, let me tell you right off the bat, you are not alone. And as people are checking in, you can see that there are gardeners from all over the world interested in the Gardener Scout community because we're all in the same boat. We are all gardeners with the same issues, the same problems, and the same concerns. Irene has already checked in from Costa Rica. And if you're gardening in Canada, you may think you've got nothing in common with Costa Rica. But let me tell you, you do. And MG's checked in from the Netherlands. Same thing. Thousands of miles separate us as gardeners, but we all have the same questions. We all have the same concerns. We may be growing different plants, but we're all gardeners. So welcome to the Gardener Scott community. Welcome to this edition of the show. Go ahead and post your questions in the comments so we can get answers to all of those issues that you think you might be the only one dealing with them, because I can assure you, you are not. Welcome everybody. Good to see you, Jennifer from Long Island, Kelsey from Brighton, nearby. Prepper Chris, good to see you again as well. I'm glad you were able to identify that you had the problem with the leaves as being powdery mildew. And I think a lot of us are going to start seeing more powdery mildew problems in the weeks ahead because it's just everywhere. You can try to do some methods in your garden where you clean up plants, you improve the airflow, particularly across your squash leaves, but powdery mildew is going to happen almost everywhere. So good luck with that. I'll talk about that more in the weeks ahead. South Africa, Sharon, great to see you here. Tennessee, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, Missouri, New Mexico, Texas, North Carolina, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Virginia. This is so crazy. It's nice to see everybody here. We're already up to almost 100. Pete in Wisconsin is checking in. Joe on the North Carolina coast. Good luck. I hope you're not too affected by the hurricane that's coming your way. It looks like it's not going to be as bad as you've probably encountered in the past, but I hope you and your garden survive well. Edgar is saying, trying to raise Chiltepequin and ghost pepper in Southern California. May have stunted leaf development, unfortunately. Yeah, good luck with that. I've grown ghost peppers in the past, the Buchalopia, and had pretty good success. For me, I had the best success in the greenhouse where they were protected from the weather. And that may be part of the issue. I know that's true in my area, and you may have something similar in California, where the outside weather, the sun, it's all so intense that the plants tend to rebel a little bit and often get stunted. But in conditions like greenhouses, where it's a consistent environment, those super hot peppers and the unique peppers I've had much more success with. So good luck with that. Barb is saying, first year I've grown okra. How do I know when to harvest it? So the few times I did okra, I went mainly on the size, and then I would squeeze it a little bit to feel the texture, but I'm not an expert on okra. So this is a call out to the rest of you in the chat. Go ahead and let Barb know what the best way is for harvesting okra. And maybe you've got some tips that I don't know, just because it's not a plant I grow very often. Travis from Maryland is checking in. Vinicio Pessoa from Brazil, thank you so much for being here. Good to have you this morning. Monica has already expressed some concern with her corn this morning and is asking about a recommendation for a good scarecrow. I think a lot of the birds nowadays, Monica, they're not concerned so much about scarecrows like you see in the movies. But I've had success when I've grown corn before to either put stakes around the corn or actually on the corn itself. If you have some old CDs, some old compact discs, hang them around your corn. And as they blow in the wind and twist, that shininess on the CD will actually scare away some of the birds, in addition to the fact that it's a moving object. You can do the same thing with foil strips. I've gone out to the garden recently, particularly with some of the blackbirds, and they're not scared by me, so I can't imagine that a scarecrow is going to have much effect. They'd learn very quickly that that's not an issue. Even if you put up one of those big fake owls, it works for a couple days, and the birds realize that it's stationary and they're not going to be concerned. And it's the stationary objects that don't have a big effect. But if you can put something that's moving, even some garden art that spins near your corn, that spinning motion, that activity, and the shininess will often detract or deter a lot of the birds. So everyone else throws suggestions of what you use to keep birds away from things like corn, but that's what I've had great success with. And many of us have a lot of old CDs that we don't listen to anymore because it's all electronic now. So think about that as an option. Nadine, good to see you again. Happy to say my garden's on autopilot right now in terms of maintenance. So I've started my fall seedlings. So far, cucumber, lettuce, eggplant, and cauliflower seedlings are doing well. Thank you for sharing that, Nadine. That's wonderful. That's kind of where I'm at in my garden as well. I just got my fall garden started, as you may have seen in recent videos, and I'm kind of on that maintenance task as well, where I'm just keeping everything alive, not starting a whole lot new, still doing some harvesting, but I love this time of year when I don't have to be working so hard to build and grow and fertilize and spray and all that kind of stuff. So great, thank you for sharing that. A Cup of Juice is saying, Gardner Scott, one of my cherry tomato plants has dried brown leaves. Still producing, but my other ones have wilted leaves. I've even watched your tomato videos that you've made. Dried brown leaves, so the thing to start looking for is a progression. It's not unusual for lower leaves on tomatoes to turn yellow and then turn brown and then fall off, or you can prune them off. But if you see the leaves have a mottled color to them, you know, maybe there's some circles on them or sets of triangles, different geometric shapes on the leaves, and then they turn brown, that tells you that you probably have a disease issue. If the leaves are perfectly green and then yellow and brown, it could be a watering issue. But if the leaves are discolored before they turn brown, it might be more serious. And so then you need to look at the leaf and the specific pattern that is developing on the leaf before they turn brown, and then do a search online, and it'll tell you what kind of disease you have. And in most cases, with many of the diseases, the serious ones, you should pull the plant and throw it away. Some of the other ones, like blight, for instance, blight is very common, early blight and late blight. The plant suffers, the fruit will suffer, but you can still harvest some of the fruit for a period of time on those plants. So take a look at the leaves before they turn brown, and that may give you a clue as to exactly what the problem is. Okay, yeah, Jake Dixon is saying shiny ribbons, CDs, aluminum pie plates. Thanks for saying that, Jake, because, yeah, I agree. As I said, I've had good success with this. Okay, James is saying, Gardner Scott, my garden boxes are enclosed with chicken wire to manage the squirrels, but my tomatoes are growing into the wire and getting stressed. Would stumping their growing stem be best? I'm not sure what you mean by stumping the growing stem. If you're talking about pruning off or pinching off the tip of the plant, that growing tip, then yes. Once you cut off the growing tip, the tomato's not going to be growing any further at that point. So you can limit the size of your tomato plant by stumping or cutting off that growing tip if it's starting to grow into something like chicken wire, because you definitely want to still keep the squirrels away if you've got a big problem with that. And that holds true with the whole plant. So if you cut off a tomato's main growing stem, and this also holds true for a plant like peppers as well. If you pinch off that growing tip, it's going to generate more growth along the plant. And so you'll get an increased amount of suckers on a tomato plant, or on a pepper plant. You can do it on purpose and get a much bushier plant because it's going to start sending out more side branches. Just be aware of that pinching off that growing tip will increase the growth along the rest of the plant. So as far as the tomatoes are concerned, you'll have to pinch off the growing tip on those suckers as well, just to keep the plant under control. Okay, let's see what else we have here. Diane is saying my pole beans are not producing lots of runners. And I want to talk a little bit about this today as well, because I had people mention this last week and had questions also during the week, particularly with beans, and the plants are stunted, they're not growing, they're not producing flowers. If they have flowers, they're not producing the bean pods. And be aware, and I've talked about this a lot in recent weeks, but temperature and weather can play a big role in how your plants are growing in the garden. So if you see a plant that isn't doing well, stop and think about what's been happening in your garden. Have you had really dry winds? Have you really had hot, sunny days? Have you had cold, humid days? If you've had some extreme weather conditions, that is often the reason for plants to be stunted, for flowers not to form completely, and for fruit not to develop. If the weather is normal and typical for your location, and you're noticing that this year maybe things are different, or you're trying some plant for the first time and it's just not growing as you're expecting, now it's probably a soil issue, and it could be nutrient related. So I know in my garden, when I've got stunted plants and they're not doing well, it's most often a weather issue because it gets too hot. If all of that is good, then I look to the soil. And in most cases, I realize, yeah, I didn't amend the bed before I put the seeds in, or I know that the nutrient levels are low and I didn't add any type of fertilizer. And so those are the two most common reasons for plants to not grow as you expect. If all of that is perfect, and if your watering is consistent and the soil is evenly moist, well, now you're looking at the potential for maybe a pest. Something has started to chew at your plant and is limiting the growth, or maybe a disease has entered the picture. So start looking at the entire environment when you start encountering issues with your plants, and a little bit of detective work can probably give you an idea of what went wrong, and that's a good way to get the idea for what to do right and how to fix it. Tyler Hand, welcome. Thank you so much for that super chat contribution. I appreciate it. It's so wonderful to see that encouragement for me every week when I see the super chats and the super stickers come into play. So Cindy is saying, hello from Connecticut. I was wondering if there is something I can put on my raised bed wood to preserve it. What have you done? So in my area, I have the biggest problem on the outside of the beds with my drying winds and the heat. And so I'll put a wood preserver. And because it's on the outside of the bed, I'm not that concerned about it. So I use just a basic wood preserver that you can find at any of the big box stores. And I'll put that on the outside of the bed, and it makes a big difference. It'll extend the life of the wood for a few years. Most wood preservers, when they're exposed to sun, like in my area, often need another application the following year, and for sure after 2 years. So that's definitely one way to do it. You can also paint your beds. use an exterior paint. I don't do that, but I've seen some beautiful gardens with the wood painted, and that also preserves it. I'm not that concerned about the inside of the beds, just because my soil doesn't tend to get really wet and rot the wood from the inside. My wood tends to rot from the outside with the conditions I have. But if you do have that kind of issue on the inside of your bed, I would encourage something like a natural oil, like linseed oil. Before you fill your bed, go ahead and oil up the wood with linseed oil and then fill the bed. That's about the only time you can do anything on the inside of the bed, because after that point the soil is in place. But there's a couple ideas: some paint, some basic wood preserver, and even linseed oil on the outside of the bed is a good way to preserve your wood. So if you've done anything different than that, by all means share it in the chat so she can see what's going on. Prepper Chris, thank you for that. Good, cool sunglasses. I appreciate your support, especially all the support and all the questions last week as well. Diane is saying, thanks, it has been very hot here lately. There you go. I noticed a few of you earlier were talking about stunted corn this year. It's happening in my area as well. We have a really cool day today, but the forecast again for this week are temperatures 5 to almost 10 degrees above normal. So a lot of us are encountering a much hotter summer than normal, and that could be the reason so many of our plants are just not growing as well as they have in other years. So let's see what we have popping up here as well. Donna Morgan, I have a 4-summer-old Culopino plant. I take it inside in the winter. I had one trunk of the plant girdled by what I call roly-poly bugs. The other trunk is still producing. That's cool. I think it's awesome when you can get a plant that you can continue to grow every year and bring it into the winter. If you notice that the trunk is girdled, if it really is girdled and they've done damage through the outer layer, that trunk may not recover. But especially for the other trunk to protect it, consider putting some kind of barrier around it. And I'll often use, you see this on my fruit trees, I'll use a white wrap around the trunk of my fruit trees, not only to protect it from the weather, but also to protect it from potential pests. Like I have voles that will burrow under the mulch and could eat the bark. So for all plants, if you notice the insects, any type of pest, are actually eating at the stem or eating at the trunk, a barrier is about the most effective thing that you can do just to keep them away from the plant. And it can be plastic, it can be cloth, it can be paper or cardboard, it can be metal, just something that you can put around the trunk to keep that pest from getting to it. MH says, Gardner Scott, so the tropical storm is rolling in, rain starting in 2 or 3 hours here in, you say in the, I'm assuming that's North Virginia. Can I go plant spinach where I just dug my potatoes, or should I wait for the storm to pass? I would wait for the storm to pass, because you've got a lot of rain coming. Now, I'll probably show you in an upcoming video, but I put in some watermelon seeds in one of the new in-ground beds that I started this year. And the next day, we had a deluge, heavy rain from a thunderstorm. I now have watermelon growing outside my bed because that heavy rain washed away some of those seeds. And the seeds were planted almost an inch deep in some of the areas. But the rain was so strong, and even though it was mulched, that was still enough to wash away those seeds. Spinach seeds are much smaller, and so I would be concerned about that heavy rain washing away some of your soil, and now you've got the seeds growing in a completely different area. So my advice would be to go ahead and wait a little bit, let the storm pass by, and in a couple days, go ahead and go back and put the seeds in where you want them to be, and then you'll have spinach growing in that bed. Otherwise, you run the risk of them being washed to another area of the garden and having the plants growing. And if you've got the space and you don't mind them growing in another area, that's okay. But I'd say go ahead and wait a little bit. Hope that helps. Okay, Prepper Chris is saying, I have 10 stalks about 2 feet. Tell what they got, 1 ear, about half size. Will they get to a full ear? Once the corn ear starts to form, it's kind of already got programmed into it what the size is going to be. It's going to start really slender, it's going to elongate, it's going to fill out, but once you start seeing the tassels form at the end, then the ear has probably reached its final size. So you might get some more plumping as the kernels expand, but as far as the length of the corn, once it reaches that point, it might grow a little bit more. Have a little bit of patience, but there's not much you can do to actually get it to grow any bigger. Like I said, it's kind of pre-programmed as to what's going to happen based on what kind of weather has already happened and the nutrients in your soil. Okay, let me go ahead and touch on something that was raised a couple weeks ago. Carrie Ramirez had asked a question. What about saran wrap or shower curtains over your cattle panel trellises if hail is coming and you don't have cover? And so this ties in a little bit with the hurricane that's hitting the eastern seaboard, but also I've got some serious weather coming today as well with hail forecast, quarter-size hail as well. So if you know that you have serious weather coming and you want to protect your plants, you can protect them with anything you have. So in my videos, I'll show putting plastic sheets over hoops, or I'll talk about hail cloth over hoops. I wouldn't recommend saran wrap because it's so thin, hail will puncture it and the wind will shred it right away. But if you've got a sheet from your linen closet that you're not using anymore, if you have an old tarp, be it a canvas tarp or a plastic tarp, if you have anything that you can put over your plants, you can use that as a protection when you encounter serious weather conditions. If it's something like heavy rain, then you might have time to build some quick structure where you've got a more rigid top, like plywood or tin or metal roofing panels, if you want to try to divert the heavy rain away from your plants. But if you just want to get out there and protect the plants right away, use whatever you have. Do be careful that you don't damage your plants, because particularly plants that are a few feet tall, they might be sturdy, but if you throw a tarp on top of it and then that tarp is filled with rainwater or heavy hail, it can actually break the plants underneath. So I encourage that you put some type of support to hold the material above your plants. But yeah, a shower curtain is great. And I've done that before. I often carry a tarp in my car because when I go get wood chips, I have to put the tarp over it and tie it down. And I've done that. When the hail was coming and it was more severe than I expected, I just went, grabbed the tarp, threw it over the plants, weighted the ends down with some rocks and bricks, and then went back in the house because I was getting pummeled by hail. So don't think that you need anything special, that you have to buy a particular type of hail cover. Just go ahead and protect your plants when you need to protect your plants. So Monica's asking, will stunted corn plant growth affect the size of the cob? Not necessarily. You can have a stunted plant and the corn cob could still grow to full size. It's most likely that the corn cob is going to be stunted to some degree because whatever the conditions were that stunted the corn plant will also probably affect the corn cob. So don't be surprised if the cob is smaller than you expect. But if the plant got stunted and then everything was fixed, the weather improved, there's nutrients in the soil, you could get a full-size corn cob even from a stunted plant. Just have to wait and see. Just make sure you're giving it some good consistent water, and good luck with that. Hope it turns out. Veronica's asking, hello from Louisville, Colorado. Tell me what to do when my tomatoes don't ripen by the first frost. I have over 13 tomato plants and several that are just so green. Good question. I will be doing a video on that soon. I'm not as close to the first frost as you are, but I'll go ahead and talk about it because a lot of my videos lately are focused on the first frost and the weather conditions changing as we finish summer and move into the fall. And so tomatoes are wonderful. And there's a couple things you can do with tomatoes. If a freeze is coming and you know that the plant is going to be killed and you have a lot of tomatoes on a plant, if you have the room, and I've done this before and it's very effective, you can pull up the whole plant with the tomatoes still on the plant. Hang the plant upside down in a garage, in a shed, somewhere where it's not going to get freezing. And those tomatoes will continue to ripen. And then you can just go out and pick the tomatoes off of an upside down plant and they'll be perfectly good. So I've done that with plants that have a lot of tomatoes on them. I hang them in my garage and it works very well. You can also just go ahead and pick off the individual green tomato fruit and then take them into your house. If you set them on the counter, they'll eventually ripen. You can wrap them in newspaper, they'll ripen. You can put them in a brown paper bag and they'll ripen. Try to have them separated from each other because they might get squishy and rot if they're touching and if they're too close to each other. But the ethylene gas that causes them to start ripening will be there. And if you want them to really ripen quickly, put them next to a bunch of bananas and you'll get ripened tomatoes as well. So don't be so concerned if they're green, they will still ripen. The texture won't be the same. The tomato won't grow anymore. So if you're used to a big beefsteak, but you're harvesting at half size, they'll turn red or whatever color you want. They'll have better flavor, but of course they won't have the same texture and the same flavor of a fully ripened tomato. But yeah, don't let them stay outside and get frozen when the frost threatens. Go ahead and bring them inside. So MH says thanks with that nice contribution as well. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I'm glad I could help you. And Prepper Chris has another super chat. Just for being you. Thank you for all you do, Mr. Scott. Thank you so much, Chris. I appreciate that. You know I love this. I say it every week, how wonderful this is to share my time with you. And so it's so good that you're all here. If you've watched a number of my videos, and I have some where I talk philosophy, and I've got another one that's coming up. So my 100th video was a philosophy video. My 150th video was a philosophy video. And my 200th video is coming up in just a couple weeks, and it will be another philosophy issue that I discuss. But what I share in my story as I created this channel in my years of being a master gardener and teaching classes is my goal is just to help a single gardener become a better gardener. That's why I do this. If I can just help one person become better, then I know that I've made a difference in the world. And so when I have right now over 175 people on this chat and the thousands of people that watch the videos every day, it just makes me feel so good because my goal is just one gardener at a time. And so to be able to talk to hundreds and thousands just is so special to me. So thank you so much for being part of the Gardener Scott community. Thank you for asking questions. Thank you for your super chat contributions. Thank you for the thumbs ups. All of that really keeps me going, and I really do appreciate it tremendously. So, so Laura's saying that you didn't see the notification this morning. I did send out a later notification. So I'm not sure why you didn't get it, or I should say I posted on my community page a little later notification this morning. YouTube is kind of weird in that way. Even if you tell them you want notifications, they don't always send out the notification. So we do this the same time every Monday. If you put it on your calendar, program it into your schedule, you'll know it's coming. And I try to stay as consistent with every Monday So no problem. For everyone who's checking in late is better than not being here at all. Golden 69 Rose, thank you so much for that sticker. That's cool. Keep it up. I will keep it up. I encourage you to keep it up as we finish our gardening seasons here in a few months. That's kind of sad, isn't it? That summer is ending in the northern hemisphere, and we're already starting to talk about what's going to happen as we move forward, moving into the fall and the winter. And actually, as I get to the rapid response round, there's a lot of questions that I'll be answering about not only plants now, but I want to discuss what we do going into the fall and going into the winter. So thank you so much for that contribution. Michelle is asking, do you have squirrel problems in your area? The problem here has never been so bad. Any advice? I don't have a big squirrel problem where I am right now, but I have had squirrel problems in the past. And the best advice that I can give you is divert the squirrels. And so in my last garden, I had a pretty big population of squirrels, but I never had a problem with squirrels in my garden because my neighbor had 5 or 6 bird feeders that were set up on the other side of my yard. And they were actually set up in my yard because I had big trees that they wanted to put their bird feeders in. So I let them come and fill the bird feeders even though they were on my side of the fence. But those bird feeders with all of the peanuts and the sunflowers and all the other seeds that were dropped to the ground, the squirrels spent all their time at the bird feeders. And they never came into the garden. They had no reason to be in the garden because they were fat and happy squirrels on the bird feeders. My brother and sister-in-law have squirrel feeders in their yard where they actually put the peanuts in the squirrel feeder on their fence. Same thing. The squirrels don't bother them at all because the squirrels are at the squirrel feeder and not bothering the garden. So if you can deter the squirrels by having another area where they'll feed, then they'll not bother your garden. Or if they do bother your garden, it'll be minimal. So that's what I have experienced to be the best way to deal with squirrels. So Carla, thank you so much for that super chat. I don't know if my week would be complete without seeing you here. So thank you so much for that. I look forward to seeing you next week. Not because of that super chat contribution, but just because I know you're getting a lot out of these. And Craig Humphreys as well. Have you ever made any videos on ponds and plants? So I haven't made any videos with plants and ponds. I've done a couple videos already with little fountain projects. But yes, I am looking to expand as I build out my garden. I am planning a very small pond area. I will be discussing some plans that's still in the future. So I don't have any videos yet. You say you're from Germany. I'm not sure if you have access to any of the videos or any of the gardening channels from the UK, but some of the best pond videos and plants in pond videos that I've seen have come from the UK, especially Monty Don and Gardening World. So if you can access Gardener's World from the UK in Germany, I encourage that you do so because they've got some incredible pond plant videos and TV shows there. But I will be doing it in the future. So that is part of my plan. Look for that. I'll be doing some videos on how to create a small pond, and then I'll be doing videos on the plants in the pond. If you've seen my videos, you know that's how I do it. I tend to do a series with a lot of videos showing every single step of the process. So thank you for asking that question because I'll make sure that I bump that up on my to-do list probably next year. Next year, I want to put in my greenhouse. I want to put in my pond and expand that whole area of my garden that isn't actually got anything growing in it right now. And then the following year, I'm going to have a really cool big water feature, like a waterfall wall in my garden. That's probably 2 years away. So stick around for at least that long because I've got 2 years worth of videos already programmed out in different time phases. So I'm planning on doing it. So thank you so much for that contribution, Craig. Sorry I couldn't direct you to any of my specific videos. And for all of you, I mentioned this a couple weeks ago, I think, about the wonderful videos that are being produced in the UK. We don't have access to a lot of that stuff here in the States. I know a lot of other countries don't either, but as far as a country that embraces gardening and then puts out the television shows and the videos to support all of that, it's just fantastic. A great resource of information is British gardening. So think about that and take a look to see what you can learn. So Heidi says, I'm going to put in a small pond to care for the dragonflies that I see a lot of in my yard. Absolutely. Dragonflies are great. And I don't have any dragonflies because I don't have that good water source. Every now and then I'll see a dragonfly buzz through my garden. But yeah, I agree with you. Water in your garden is a great way to attract many beneficial insects. And so I've got my one fountain right now that you may have seen in the videos. I'll be adding these other water features because that's a great way to encourage all the wildlife, but especially the beneficial insects. They need a water source. And so a small pond, a small fountain, something in your garden will make a huge difference in reducing a lot of the pests you have. You might not think that there's a direct correlation, but if you put a small pond in your garden, mark my words, you will probably see a reduction in some of the pest problems you have in your vegetable garden. Especially if you start putting flowers around that little pond or water feature. Start growing extra plants and put in some water, and then it becomes autopilot. You just have to worry about minimal maintenance because you won't have as many pests to deal with. So that's definitely what I'm planning on doing. So John Ann Johnson, thank you for the reminder to give a thumbs up. I do appreciate the thumbs up. It's so nice, especially when you all encourage each other to do that. So that's wonderful. Nadine is saying, any worries about mosquitoes with the pond? Yes. I don't have a lot of mosquitoes. One of the benefits of living in Colorado with a garden at 7,500 foot elevation and extremely dry, windy air is we have almost no mosquitoes. I got bitten by a mosquito about 2 weeks ago, and it's probably the first time in 2 or 3 years. So I don't have a mosquito problem, which is why I can put in a pond and not be too concerned. But if you do have a mosquito problem, there are lots of things you can do. You can put a fountain so that you keep the water moving, and that will reduce the possibility of the mosquito larvae growing in your little pool or your little pond. There are some little floating discs that have BT, Bacillus thuringiensis. I believe there's a type that is specifically meant for mosquito larvae that you can put in a pond area. I don't encourage chemicals, but you could do some things just to keep the water clean and that are also effective against the mosquito larvae. So no, I don't have that issue, but if you live in an area with mosquitoes, then sure, you should be concerned about that. But you can also put fish. If you're growing a pond that's big enough, put some koi or some goldfish in your pond. They'll take care of your mosquitoes. That's what I did at the Galileo greenhouse, where we had a big tank of water and never had a mosquito issue. But one of the things we did was have big goldfish in that tank of water. They'll eat the mosquito larvae as well. So there are things you can do. Yeah, do take that into account if you have that kind of issue. And Jonan is asking, do you do anything to increase bats? At the Galileo Garden, I did build a bat house. And that is in my plans to do at this garden, is to build a bat house. So yes, I have done that. I am planning on doing that in the future. There are some very specific requirements for a bat house. It needs to be very high. The inside measurements of the different boards have to be very precisely measured apart. But yeah, do a little research into a bat house, and that may be a way to encourage them in your area. And they'll take care of a lot of those things like mosquitoes and the other insects that might enjoy your pond just as much as the beneficial insects. Okay, let's see what else we have popping up here. Richard says Ontario is a mosquito haven. You have a much more humid environment than I do. And in fact, most of Canada seems to be a mosquito haven. So I'm sure you've got some tricks you can share with us. That would be wonderful. Okay. Richard's asking, do you need to clean out a bat house? Not really, because the way a bat house is designed is that the bottom is open. So the bats will actually fly in to the bottom and then climb up to the roost inside the bat house. And so the guano will just drop out the bottom of the bat house. And because it's so high, it's really difficult to get to clean anyway. But I'm not aware that the stuff I've read and all of the plans I followed for setting or building the bat house, that was never even a consideration because the bottom is open. But good question. Thanks for asking. Okay, Arena Kim is asking, will birds eat the minnows? So I think this is going back to other fish that might be in the pond. Depending on what kind of fish you have, this is what's so cool about ponds. And I encourage always to build an entire environment, a natural environment in your garden setting. So if you have a pond setting, you'll have an increase in insects. If you have the fish, you'll have an increase in the bird activity and raccoon activity that are probably coming after the fish. And if you have an increase in the bird activity, you might have an increase in owl activity or cats. Depends on how you view that and whether you want to try to control it or not. So when I have had the pond setting in the past and when I've talked to others who have ponds, sometimes you just have to write off those losses. So if you have fish that you're planning to putting into a pond setting, you're probably going to lose some of those fish to some predator that's existing in nature. Be ready to add more fish. If you have plants that are in that pond, you're probably going to lose those plants to weather or to some other pest that you didn't even know existed. But eventually, if all of the pieces fall together, it reaches equilibrium. And so you'll have some losses, but you'll have gains in other areas, which makes it so incredible and which makes it so fun to enjoy, to observe, to watch how all of this stuff is happening. So I encourage all of this kind of stuff. Do it. Increase the nature that exists in your garden. And even when I have losses, I just look at it as I'm doing it right because nature is taking care of nature, which is one of the coolest things that I think you can have. Tamara is saying, a lot of my corn is 10 feet tall and the tassels have come out 1 week ago on many, but only one stalk had silk come out. How long does it take before the silks come out? I can't give you a specific timeline, but they should be pretty closely related. So if the plant is healthy, you're going to have all of it happening within a couple week period because corn is wind pollinated. And so the plant is designed, those little silks that come out of the ends of the ears, those have to receive the pollen from above for the corn to be pollinated and for those kernels to grow. The plant knows that. That's just the way it is. So even though the tops of the plants may look like they're growing and that the silk hasn't come out yet, don't be too worried about those tassels because they probably haven't reached the point that they are forming pollen. And about the time that the pollen starts developing, you should start seeing the silks, and then it all plays naturally together, and the wind pollinates and everything works together. So just because you have the tall corn and you see that growth coming out of the top doesn't mean that the plant is ready to pollinate itself yet. So hang back a little bit, have a little bit of patience. Hopefully it'll all work out pretty early in the next couple weeks, I'm guessing. And do let us know. So Michelle, thank you so much for that sticker. Big thumbs up. I like that bird thumbs up. Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay. Wendy's asking, how do I control the growth of indeterminate tomato plants? They are getting really tall and my garden sticks could not hold them. This goes back to that question I answered earlier. Pinch off that growing tip or prune it. And you can do it actually at any point. If you think your tomato plant is too tall, you can cut it back as far as you want. But on tomatoes, they will continue to grow and grow and grow, the indeterminate tomatoes, until they're killed by disease or cold weather. So what you need to do is at the top of the plant, where you see the new leaves coming out, cut that off. And the plant will not get any taller at that point. But, as I said earlier as well, it's going to generate even more of the side shoots, of those suckers. It's going to encourage their growth. If you've been plucking out and pinching off those suckers, it's not as big a concern. But if there are suckers in place, those suckers are now going to grow into tomato plants. They're going to keep growing and growing and growing. Do the same thing. You find the tip where the new leaves are emerging on those side shoots, on those suckers, pinch those off. And that sucker won't grow anymore. The side shoot has a final size. So that's the way you keep a tomato plant under control, is to pinch off the growing tips. And you can shape a plant. You can prune it to fit whatever trellis you have by just keeping its growth in check. And that's also going to send energy to the fruit. So especially as we get close to the cold conditions, and I'll show you this in a video in probably about a month, that's a great way to get the tomatoes that are on the plant to ripen faster. If a frost is imminent, bring them inside like I talked earlier. But if you know that you have a frost coming typically in like 2 or 3 weeks, by pinching off those growing tips, now all the plant's energy is going into the tomatoes that are on the plant. And that will help them ripen a little bit faster and grow a little bit bigger. So definitely think about pruning your tomato plants, especially as we move a little further along in the season. Okay, Richard saying, my tomato trellis string snapped due to recent heavy rain. Can I restring my vines? Absolutely, absolutely. You may have seen in some of my tomato videos where I use the tomato clips. And so when I've had the twine break, or sometimes it's come untied from the top of the trellis and I have to put it all back together again, I actually find that the tomato clips make it easier to retie the plant, because I'll just run the new string all the way down through the middle of the plant, and then I can just take the clips, attach it to the twine, and put it around the stem of the plant. So you can actually go to some of my tomato videos, the pruning and the trellising videos. I think I have links to some of those tomato clips that you can find. I just bought another bag of tomato clips because I'm going to be doing a lot more of my trellising as my plants get bigger. But yes, absolutely, you can retrain it, reattach it with new twine. You can wrap it around. That's why I like the tomato clips, because if you try to wrap it around the plant after it's broken, it can be a little more difficult. I just think the clips are the easy way to go. But yeah, you can definitely do it. Michelle Deal saying, got the clips because of Gardener's Gut, and you love them. Thanks so much. Yeah, it's one of those inventions. It's like, until you discover them, you don't know they exist. And then when you find that they exist, you think, how could I possibly have lived without this? So I have hundreds of the tomato clips, and I use almost all of them every season. So yeah, do look for that tomato clip link on my tomato videos and add them to your repertoire, because they definitely work. Yeah, Richard's saying that he's got the clip. So good, good. That's a good way to get a tomato plant growing the way that you want them to grow. It's so much easier. Okay, so I want to see what your comments are. So go ahead and start commenting. Last week I had asked a question because when I was talking about the philosophy, I said change your perspective. Look at your garden in a different way from low, high, an insect's perspective, a child's perspective. But I asked the question that I posed it to you, then it said I would ask the question this week about what new discoveries you found in your garden this last week. And so I'd like to hear some of those right now. Share your discoveries. Monica already started right off the bat earlier today talking about the wasp that she saw, the biggest one she's ever seen in her garden. That's what I'm talking about. The kind of things that you saw this week that either you've never seen before or that you saw it from a new perspective and never appreciated it as much. Or maybe something that you saw in your garden because you created it. You put something new in your garden because you wanted to create a new perspective. So share those with me now if you would, because I think this is also one of those special things where if we get in the habit of looking at our garden and really seeing it with a new eye, then we appreciate it more and we enjoy it even more. And then when you can share it, like I started at the beginning of the video talking about, even though we're gardeners from all over the world, we have the same enjoyment, the same wonderment, and the same issues in our garden. So share some of those things with us right now, and I wouldn't be surprised, you may think you are the only one that's seen a giant wasp in your garden, but there's lots of the rest of us that have also seen it. Blasphemous Buddha saying the pollinators are enjoying the borage. Borage is a wonderful plant to grow in your garden. I got seeds. I didn't put them in this year. It was one of those plants I had intended to grow but didn't. If you want to grow a wonderful plant in your garden, borage is the plant to grow. It's very hardy. It can handle some terrible weather extremes. It's edible, and the pollinators and the beneficial insects love borage. So glad to hear that, because if you're growing it, you already are doing wonderful things in your garden. That's great. Okay, let's see. Nadine is saying lots more butterflies in the pollinator pathway. We love butterflies. That's great. Richard used to pull the milkweed. Now you don't because of the beautiful monarch butterflies. Good for you. Yeah, milkweed's the only thing that the monarchs feed upon. So there's a lot of those kind of things, a lot of those weeds that we thought were weeds, but when we look at them from a butterfly's perspective, we realize that you don't necessarily need to pull that weed. You're adding something to the garden. Mama Mars is saying hollyhocks are chewed by beetles. Next year I plan on chickens, and I actually want to talk about chickens today, so I'll get to that in just a minute. So yes, chickens can definitely be wonderful. That's great. So let's see what we got here. Big B, the fluffy redneck, says, I've noticed a lot of carpenter bees and other bees just flying, going into all the flowers and all the plants. Watermelons, cucumbers, zucchini, they were going nuts. Good for you. That's great. Bees are so wonderful, and I'll talk about this in just a minute with one of the questions that was asked last week. Start keeping track of your bees, because it's one of those things that we all think bees are honeybees, but there are thousands of species of bees. I think it's 4,000 species of bees in the United States. And if you start looking at the pollinators in your garden with your flowers, you'll see bees of different sizes and shapes and colors, and it's so cool if you can start identifying the different types of bees. So another great perspective is to look at that kind of stuff. Prepper Chris says tiny little bees attacking the sunflower. It was so cool. It is. It's so cool when you realize that there are more bees out there than honeybees. Jay Dixon, the new perspective. I'm enjoying the benefits of successive sowing for more crops better than ever. Good for you. Yeah, I had the video about successive sowing, and it's one of those things that you suddenly start doing these new things, and it does make it all better. It does encourage the whole thing to grow. Raymond's asking, can I still eat leaves infected by leafhoppers raw without cooking? You can. Yeah, leafhoppers do have the possibility of putting some potential disease into plants. There'll be some damage. You can still eat those leaves. A lot of the insect damages that you have you can still eat the fruit or the leaves without too much trouble. Okay, Richard's saying, not all weeds are bad. My pepper plants are growing next to a weed which the caterpillars love, leaving my peppers alone. Yeah, I've talked about that as well before. The sacrificial plants. And a lot of those sacrificial plants are the weeds that we would have pulled in the first place. I've done that. I noticed I had some aphids earlier this year that were attacking some of those weedy plants around the edge that I used to pull. Well, I didn't pull those plants because the aphids loved them, and I was able to sow my seeds and not have any aphid damage at all because they were someplace else. And that also meant, because I had the aphids on all those other weedy plants, that's where the ladybugs first showed up. So the ladybugs were on those weedy plants, laying eggs, growing, increasing their population, and then when they came back to the regular plants in the garden, there were way more ladybugs than might normally exist. So great observation. That's so cool. Okay, Basil Fables. Pet dragonfly drinks water out of my cupped hand every day. That is incredible. That is so cool. It would be wonderful if you could get some video of that. You probably already have, but a dragonfly that drinks water out of your hand. That is awesome. I've never seen that. I'm going to have to try to start doing that. I know you can do that with hummingbirds. I've seen a lot of that, and we got close to that with our hummingbird feeders, where you can train the hummingbirds to feed out of your hand. But that's cool with the dragonflies. Thank you for sharing that. Greg Hill says, I got a volunteer grapevine growing directly behind the grape trellis in my garden, a different variety than the ones I have. Interesting. It could be a mutation from the grapes that you do have. Keep following what fruit develops from that grapevine, and you may have something really cool, totally different. I've had that happen with tomatoes before. That's so cool. Okay, thank you for sharing all that. Tammy is saying we had Japanese beetles attack the weedy grapevines that do nothing rather than my garden. Yeah, wonderful. That sacrificial concept. And this gets back to what I was talking earlier as well. It's getting that whole environment working in your favor, where you think one thing is bad, like weeds, but weeds can really be good. It's only a weed because it's growing in a place you didn't want it to grow. But if it's growing in a place and it's bringing in good insects or taking away the bad insects, then really it's no longer a weed. It really is a plant that is serving a function in your garden. So encourage all of that. That's just absolutely incredible. So Mark 1 is asking, how do you get rid of the tomato worms? Most of the tomato, like the tomato hornworms, the really big ones, they're huge, but they're still so difficult to see. So you go out and you pluck them off by hand. That's about the most effective thing you can do. At night, you can go out with a black light or a flashlight. They might be a little bit easier to see. I've heard people say that in really quiet areas, you can actually hear those hornworms chewing the leaves. And don't know the validity. I just heard the stories of gardeners who were able to find those in the dark at night because they could hear them chewing. I've never had that happen to me. I suppose it's possible, but see if you can hear them chewing. But the other thing I do, I've talked about this before as well, is encourage the birds. Birds eat a lot of caterpillars, and if you encourage birds in your garden, you'll have fewer caterpillar issues. You can also spray BT, the Bacillus thuringiensis that I mentioned earlier about the mosquitoes. There's a type that you can put on your leaves if you have a caterpillar problem, and it will kill the caterpillars when they eat the leaves. So pluck them off, encourage the birds, use BT, and that's a great way to get rid of the caterpillars. Okay, Let's go ahead and get into our rapid response round questions. Woo Too Much had asked, do you have any advice or experience with topsy-turvy type gardening? And so I talked about this in live stream last week or the week before about growing the topsy-turvy, the upside down tomatoes. Yes, I've had experience in that. I haven't had a happy experience. The plants I grew that way did not grow nearly as well as the tomato plants that grew in pots or beds. So if you want something fun, try it. It's a great way to learn something new. Do some topsy-turvy upside down tomato gardening. But if you're doing it because you think it's going to give you a lot more tomatoes, you'll be mistaken. That's not going to happen. Luz Robles and Niall Doyle also had this question last week. It's, when should I pull the zucchini plants I put in at the beginning of spring? And so as we move into the summer, you'll see this. Zucchini plants, cucumber plants, many of the squashes, they'll grow to a certain size. They're putting out their fruit all along the way. And then you notice fewer flowers. And the flowers that do develop, the fruit may not be as big or it might be misshapen. The plant is pretty much spent. It's done. This is one of the hardest things to do as a gardener, to intentionally pull a plant that is alive. But when the zucchini, the other squashes, the cucumbers, when they start fading, when they're just not producing anymore, pull them. In the beginning, a cucumber plant's going to grow, and it's going to give you a flower and a cucumber at almost every leaf junction along that stem. So you have a lot of new cucumbers to look forward to. But as the plant ages and starts reaching the limits of its growth, it's not going to happen anymore. You're not going to get that new growth, and you're not going to get those new flowers and fruit. So when you see that happening, you have a choice. Do you leave one of those plants in the ground for another 2 or 3 weeks to get 1 or 2 new fruits that you can harvest? Or do you go ahead and pull it and put in a new plant that can benefit from an extra 2 to 3 weeks of growth? So I encourage you. It's hard, I know it. I still have difficulty with it. But I encourage, when you notice that your plants have reached a point that they're just not producing like they used to, go ahead and pull it and go ahead and start putting in your fall garden. Okay, Janet had asked, I have flowers and beans on my wax bush beans, but no flowers or beans on my pole beans. Is this typical? It's often typical when you are growing different types of plants side by side or in the same bed that you will see different results. This happens with beans, it happens with squashes, and it's often because of the variety. Different varieties will mature at different rates. So have patience. As I started off at the beginning and talking about weather and nutrients and all the rest, that does play a factor. But if you have 2 similar types of plants with different varieties and they're growing very close to each other, but one's not performing as well, it could just be a time issue. That variety needs more time to develop. So I wouldn't be too concerned about it. Dixie Green, any way to help pollinate my bean flowers? So beans are one of those plants, the flowers are going to pollinate themselves. Now, you can go out and shake the plant just to loosen any pollen that might be inside those flowers. But for the most part, you really don't need to worry too much about beans and peas because they're going to pollinate themselves. And there's not much you can do about it. Wind helps, shaking the plant helps, but I wouldn't be too concerned about it either way. Maxillaria, I don't have a first frost date here in Los Angeles. How should I decide when the timing is right to start fall and wintering crops? So again, this kind of gets back to that idea of pulling the zucchini or the cucumbers when they start to fade. So my recent videos talked a lot about starting a fall garden. If you have an area that has very little frost, almost no freezing, you can actually carry that gardening into the winter. And the way to know is to look at your calendar and to look at your seed packets. How long is it going to take that seed to develop, to grow into a plant, and then give you a harvest? And that's really the best way when you live in an area like Arizona or Southern California or Florida, where you have a really long growing season. Go to your calendar, and when you start seeing your summer plants fading, well, even though the weather's still warm, just say, okay, summer's over, fall begins, and pull up those summer plants and put a fall garden in place. As you're approaching the winter season, you know what your lowest winter conditions are. So now you can choose those plants that don't necessarily grow well in the hot, sunny days that you probably have, but will do well in the cool days ahead of winter. And grow those types of plants, the spinach, the chard, those kind of things. Do be aware, and I've got a video coming out in about a month where I'll talk about this. There is a time period that in the United States typically runs from mid-December to mid-February, depending on where you are, where the amount of sunlight during the day is not enough for many plants to grow well. So they'll enter kind of a mild dormancy, just like a lot of our plants enter kind of a dormancy during the hot sun and heat of summer. They'll do the same in the winter when the sunlight is just too little. So go ahead and grow into the winter. Just be aware that there's a period there where the plants aren't going to do well. But then as the sunlight lengthens, they'll do fine. Heidi Clark had asked, can I use burlap without straw when starting my fall garden seeds? Absolutely. So in my how to grow a fall garden video, I showed putting burlap on top of the straw to keep the soil moist so that the seeds would germinate. I did that for, I think it was only 3 or 4 days before my seeds were germinating, and I pulled the burlap off, and they pushed right through that straw. If you don't have the straw down first, definitely. You can use burlap by itself on top of your soil when you're sowing seeds in summer. It helps cool the soil, it helps keep the soil moist, it helps those seeds germinate. But after a few days, start looking underneath the burlap just so that you're not going to smother and cover the plants. Because one of the worst things you can do is leave the burlap on too long. The seedlings emerge. Now, they don't have any sunlight. They're not going to start photosynthesis. So they're going to be that really light green or even a white color. Now, when you remove the burlap, they're going to be exposed to the sun and it's going to fry the plants right away. So burlap's only in place for a few days, but you don't have to have a mulch underneath it to use. Jim Ward had asked, can I use normal fabric to shield pumpkins? I've seen people use orange fabric, but maybe that is a dated way of doing it. Absolutely. So shielding your pumpkins leads to a lot of benefits. If the shell starts drying out, the pumpkin's not going to grow anymore. So it needs to stay nice and moist, flexible and pliable. And so you can cover your pumpkins with fabric to shield them from the sun to allow the pumpkins to continue to grow before they reach that final point and that outer shell starts to harden. Doesn't have to be orange. In fact, I think a lot of people that use orange fabric just want to see the orange in their pumpkin patch, but it can be any type of fabric that you want to shield the pumpkins. It'll be fine. Larry Adams, I've got a lot of tomatoes on the vine at different stages of growth. None are ripening yet. Should I be concerned? And this ties into all the discussion that I already had about the weather. It's probably the temperature. Just like I've said in the past, that if the temperature is above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, but the flowers aren't going to pollinate, well, if they've pollinated and are starting to grow, if you have temperatures that are regularly above 85 to 90 degrees, the fruit is also going to enter one of those periods where it's not going to grow at a rapid rate. Once the daytime temperatures start cooling off a little bit, you should see increased growth and increased ripening of your tomatoes. So think of it as a plateau. The fruit develops, it grows, and then it hits the really hot days, and the fruit just kind of levels off. It stays green, and for many of us, it seems like it just stays green forever. But once the days start cooling off a little bit, you'll start noticing some color change and the fruit will start ripening again. So it's not a big deal. Our wood chip garden, I want to grow in the winter. Kale, I know will grow. What others? So chard, spinach, beets, and I'm assuming when you say in winter that you're talking about an area kind of like the Southern California where it gets cool, maybe a little cold, but the plants will still survive. If you're growing in a region like mine, like a 5B garden, where it could potentially get down to -20 during the winter, I can't have a winter garden. If you're in zone 6, where it gets down to -10 potentially, you probably can't have a winter garden outside. But if you have a garden that gets down to maybe the mid-20s Fahrenheit or hovers around freezing, then yes, you can definitely have a winter garden, and all of those really hardy, cool vegetables that I just mentioned, in addition to kale, can definitely be grown in a winter garden in that kind of setting. Okay, James Hanold, if I am out of town for a weekend, will plants be okay unwatered for 2 or 3 days? Possibly. Depends on your weather, depends on your humidity. So if you're planning a short vacation and you're wondering how well your garden will do, I encourage you to test it. A couple weeks before your vacation, change your watering. If you know you're going to be gone for 2 or 3 days, then stop watering your garden for 2 or 3 days and see what happens. If you notice certain areas really drying out, then maybe you can put shade cloth in place or some extra mulch to reduce the soil evaporation, and then water and see if it goes 2 or 3 days. So test it. See if your garden can handle 2 or 3 days. If you find that it can't, then do some remedial efforts to get your garden growing to the point that you can walk away for 2 or 3 days. You won't know it till you do it. I do not recommend doing all of your normal gardening activities every day, watering every day, weeding every day, doing all those activities, and then just up and deciding that you're going to go on vacation and be gone and then come back and expect everything to be as you left it. My daughter just had a week vacation, and she had people that were taking care of their garden space, but they came back and she already discovered plants growing in the garden that weren't there when she started. So even 2 or 3 days, you're going to notice some differences, especially for a longer period of time. Get someone to come help you out, particularly with the watering, but test it beforehand so that you know what to expect when you come back. Jacob Workington, do you have any gardening books to recommend? And so I told you I was going to mention this when I was talking about the bees. So one of the books I recommend is The Bees in Your Backyard. It's a wonderful book, and it tells all the different species that you might encounter and their whole lifestyle, all of that wonderful bee activity. Epic Tomatoes is a wonderful book that I recommend, that has wonderful pictures, tells history, stories about tomatoes, how to grow tomatoes. That's another great book. I have actually a really long list of books that I recommend. If you look at the description below my videos, and you'll see it in the replay of this live stream, just go to any of my videos, my newer videos, go down into the description box, and you'll actually see a link to my recommended books. And I think right now I'm up to about 15 or 16 on that particular list. So check it out in the description of my videos. That'll take you to my recommended book list. There's a bunch of them out there, but I wanted to highlight those two this week in particular: Epic Tomatoes and The Bees in Your Backyard. Those are wonderful. Camille had asked, what method of organic fertilization do you recommend for container gardening? Should you really need to take all of the soil out and mix it with compost or other stuff? So the thing about container gardens, if you prepare your soil in the first year with organic material, and if you've seen my container gardening videos so far, I mix in usually a little bit of Osmocote fertilizer into that soil. You probably don't need to fertilize at all in that first year. The soil should be enough to support the plants. If you don't want to take the soil out and mix in more compost and more fertilizer going into the second year, then I would recommend a fertilizer, like a liquid fertilizer. I'll use comfrey tea. You can use compost tea. You could use seaweed. You could use fish emulsion. Those are some good organic fertilizers that are general. They'll give a relatively even mix of nutrients in very small levels. You want to make sure you're getting some of that nitrogen into it. I'll use some Bloodmeal, I'll use some Bonemeal. Most of the time I mix that into the soil. And that'll get you through the second year. For container gardening, for sure, in that third year, you probably should remove the soil and blend in some more organic materials like compost. And then again, if you do all that mixing of organic materials and a little bit of inorganic fertilizer when you have the soil, you probably won't need much fertilizer at all, even in that first year. I'm Mark Wise, had asked about BT for cabbage loopers on broccoli and Brussels sprouts. Yes or no? Yes. If you have any type of caterpillar, and that's what a looper is, it's a little inchworm that you've probably seen, use BT. Any plant that a caterpillar is going to be eating, a BT that is specifically designed for caterpillars will be effective, even if it's a plant like broccoli. And the BT is not harmful at all for humans and animals to eat. So definitely consider that on broccoli and Brussels sprouts. Benjamin Wilson, I have a big problem with cucumber beetles. Will ladybugs eat these? And how do I attract more? So the ladybugs will not eat the cucumber beetles, but ladybugs will eat the cucumber beetle eggs. And so, like I talked earlier about the weeds, the way to encourage more ladybugs is to encourage more of the kind of plants that aphids will eat and that ladybugs will lay their eggs in. And a lot of that are grasses. There are a lot of herbs, like dill, for instance, is a great plant to grow that will attract a lot of those insects, even ladybugs. So start growing a lot of those different kinds of plants around the edges of your garden. That'll attract the beneficial bugs like the ladybugs. And they'll take care of the eggs before the eggs become a problem, like with cucumber beetles. Green Love has asked, I noticed you used Osmocote, which is an inorganic fertilizer. What are your thoughts on organic versus inorganic fertilizers? And so my thoughts are a little bit of what I shared. I think the soil is one of the most important components in gardening. So if you can improve your soil, the plants will do well. If you've seen any of my recent videos in the garden, I have big, lush, green, healthy plants with very minimal insect damage. I have not fertilized any of my plants so far this year, and I'm not planning on fertilizing my plants as we move forward in the year because I spent time putting organic material into the soil and putting inorganic fertilizers like Osmocote, which is more mineral based. That's improving the soil, which makes for a healthy plant. And then I don't have to worry about an organic fertilizer after that point. Now, as far as organic fertilizers, yes, there are definitely situations that you need it. If you see your plant is suffering, if you're not sure about the nutrient level of your soil, then add some of those organic fertilizers. I just prefer to focus on the soil. And inorganic fertilizers, which are typically slow release and work over a longer period of time, are a great way to amend your soil. That's why I use the Osmocote. In my potting mixes, which is a little more need for sooner fertilization and something a little more water soluble, I'll use Bloodmeal and Bonemeal. Uh, that's all I need for a short period of time before those plants are going into prepared soil conditions. So by all means, use organic fertilizers. I will add some comfrey tea to my tomatoes as the season progresses, but that's about it. Other than that, I really try to get a good, healthy soil. If you feed your soil, then the soil will feed your plants. So Craig Humphreys, thank you so much for that super chat contribution. I have a large oak tree in my garden. Would you recommend using acorns in a compost heap? I get thousands each year. Sure, yeah. In the moist conditions of a compost heap, the acorns actually can break down pretty quickly. Some of them might actually try to germinate, which is even better because now you have some growing material from the acorn that you can add to your pile. Depending on how you compost, if you are doing a quick composting method, like hot composting, where you're turning the pile regularly, you're keeping it moist, you're building up the high temperatures, those acorns will break down, they will decompose, but it's not going to be quick. So you may want to sift the compost when you use it and sift out some of those acorns and some of the harder shells that didn't decompose yet. But oak leaves, acorns, all of that, add it to your compost pile. I will also encourage you to maybe try something a little bit different. You probably know about leaf mold. Make a big pile of leaves and mix some of the acorns into that pile. If you have access to manure, especially chicken manure, mix it into that pile as well, and have a completely separate compost heap that is made up of nothing but leaves and acorns and a little bit of nitrogen like the manures. And you'll also get a really nice rich compost. It takes longer for those materials to break down, but that leaf mold that results is filled with nutrients. A lot more minerals are in leaf mold than you'll get in a typical compost heap. So by all means, go for it. I think that's a great way to do it. Raymond saying Bloodmeal and Bonemeal are not available in Indonesia. Are they something I can make myself? You can. I don't have any videos on it. I've seen some sources, but if you are making chicken or beef or pork or whatever meat you might eat, you can save the bones, and then you can bake those bones so that they dry out, and then you can crush those bones, and that's essentially what bone meal is. It's just crushed up bones, so you can easily do that at home. The blood meal is a little more difficult, but anybody, if you have chickens that you slaughter, yeah, you can save that blood and do the same thing. You dry it out and then you powder it and add that to your soil. That's what blood meal is. It's just dried blood. So it is something you can do at home. You may need to take some, or may involve some extra work to get the materials baked and dried and crushed. But it is something to consider if you want to venture into that realm. I know that we don't have many people that do that here in the States because it's so readily available, but I know that you are many thousands of miles from me. Try it. If you do try it, let me know. John Ann is saying, Gardener Scott, have you written a book? If not, you should. Thank you for saying that. I did have a blog, and you can actually access many of the articles on my blog at my gardenerscott.com site. And I don't do much to keep the gardenerscott.com site active and open, but there's a lot of blog articles that I've written, and I have had that thought of taking a lot of the stuff that I already have written and maybe someday put it into a book form. But I'm just staying so busy right now with doing the things that I'm doing that it's not high on my list. But maybe someday. Thank you for the encouragement. I appreciate that. Denver 1865, I saw an unusual black-winged bug that was sort of like a huge ant, not identified. It was dragging a spider that I don't think was dead. Does anyone know what that could be? It's probably a wasp. I've seen some of those here in Colorado. I actually got some footage of one once that was the other way around. I actually have some footage of a spider dragging one of those winged wasps into its nest. So I think they are mortal enemies back and forth. But because it looked like an ant, it was probably a wasp. And that's another great thing about the Bees in Your Backyard book that I recommended that you can link on in the description. It tells the difference between wasps and bees. And the thorax, the abdomen, is one great way to tell. And so ants and wasps have very similar thorax. And that's one way to tell it's a wasp. So it's probably a predatory wasp that likes to eat spiders. If you can take a picture of it, you might be able to identify it online. But I have seen those here, and that's my guess. They're some beautiful insects. In most cases, they're not going to sting you. So, yellow jackets might sting you, but most of the wasps we have in our garden could care less about people, and they're not going to sting you, which is why I leave them alone and like to see what they have. Kiri Nowak is saying, Gardener Scott, Daisy and Josie say good morning from Colorado Springs. Hello to Daisy and Josie, and also to Kiri Nowak. Thank you for giving me the opportunity for that shout out. I hope you're all online right now and watching the live stream. Just so you know why I'm spending so much effort talking about Kiri and Daisy and Josie, that's my family. So Kiri is my daughter. If you go back to my previous live streams and you see the timestamps where you can go right to a specific topic, and also when I refer to previous questions and give answers, well, it's my daughter Kiri that is preparing all of that. She goes through all the live streams, puts all of your questions and comments into an easily readable format for me so that I can then refer back to them in future videos. So she's a huge help on this channel, and I encourage you to give a thumbs up to Kiri because she does a lot of effort to help all of you out and actually does a lot to help me out. And Daisy and Josie are my granddaughters. You may have seen them in some of my previous videos as well. I've got a video coming up here pretty soon where we painted some rocks, and they're already in the garden. So the video that's coming out on Wednesday is about strawberries and propagating strawberries, and you'll see some of their handiwork in my strawberry patch. So glad you all are online and watching, and welcome back. I already told you they were on vacation this last week, so I'm glad that they came back safe. Rebecca's asking, is there an increased risk of fungal or bacterial infection if I use well water in my garden, or is it safe to use? For the most part, well water should be okay for your garden. There is an increased possibility of bacteria in particular, because those of us that are on city water or town water, it's often treated usually with chlorine to kill bacteria. Well water isn't going to have that. So there will be bacteria in the water, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, because if you're watering your garden with well water, then you're probably getting some of that good bacteria that is naturally occurring in your garden area and in your soil. There could be a potential for E. coli and some of those other type of problems that could cause problems with you. So I will do the caveat. Unless you've had your well water tested, I would say use well water on bushes and trees and shrubs, and maybe not use it on the vegetables, particularly the leaves that you're going to be eating. So do be a little concerned about the well water in that respect. But generally, as far as watering plants, yeah, well water is fine. I know we're getting close to the end time, but I still have a lot I want to talk about. So hopefully you won't mind if we go a little long today. I want to talk about chickens real quickly, just because I've had some questions that have popped up recently. And the thing about chickens is they can be very beneficial in the garden. They'll eat a lot of those insects that are on the ground, that are underneath the mulch. They'll eat the eggs of the insects. They do a lot for taking care of some of those pests that you have in your garden. So I strongly encourage chickens in the garden. However, they'll also eat the leaves of the plants that you're going to eat, and they'll also eat the fruit of the plants that you're harvesting and wanting to eat. So chickens in the garden should probably be timed. So like right now, we're talking about pulling the cucumbers and pulling the squash plants and then putting in a fall garden. Well, in that brief period where you're pulling out plants and then putting in new plants, let the chickens go free. They'll actually help break up the soil, and they're adding manure as well. They're adding some benefits to the garden and to the soil. So let them run free in your garden in those interim periods, and also at the end of the season. They'll actually add some benefit to cleaning up your garden, eating some of the scraps that could be potential nesting sites for some of those harmful insects. They definitely play a role in the garden, but be careful about letting your chickens just run free, because they'll do a lot of damage as well. So I just want to throw that out, talk about chickens just briefly. They're very good for the garden, eating the insects, eating a lot of weed seeds, but it's not necessarily one of those things you want in your garden during the active growing season. So Craig Humphreys, thank you again for that contribution. And you're asking, what about using pool water on the garden? So by all means, you can use pool water on the garden. If it's a swimming pool that is heavily chlorinated, I might suggest that you have a holding pond in between. So for instance, take a kiddie pool. Take some of the water from your swimming pool and put it into the kiddie pool, because if you put highly chlorinated water into your garden, you run the risk that you could kill some of that really good soil bacteria. But chlorine dissipates in just a few hours. And so by having that pool in between, like the kiddie pool where you take some pool water, or take pool water in buckets and just let the buckets sit out overnight, that'll be enough time for that chlorine to dissipate, and then definitely you can add it to your garden. That would be my only concern with pool water. If you have a pond and it's getting late in the season and you're going to drain your pond, that's ideal for putting into a garden. It kind of plays in with the well water idea, where it's got a lot of really good bacteria growing in it, a lot of that soil and naturally occurring bacteria, and it can be great for your soil to use that type of pond water or that type of pool water. But it's coming straight out of the pool and it's chlorinated. I encourage that you have a little bit of time just to help that chlorine dissipate. Okay, let's get into a little bit of philosophy time. And so what I want to talk about this week, I think is kind of interesting. You may not have heard this idea before. But when you garden, what do you think about in the garden? And now I want to add this to your thoughts. The garden is a time machine. And you probably thought this way, but not really realized it in this way. When you're looking at a tree, especially a tree that you planted years ago, it's one of those things that I'll look at a fruit tree, even the fruit trees that I just planted a year ago, and I'm looking into the past and into the future. So the fruit tree reminds me when I planted it, when it was just a little sapling, and how much it's grown. And I can see the passage of time in an instant by looking at that fruit tree. And also, just because of the way I garden and the visions that are playing in my mind, when I look at that fruit tree, I'm also looking into the future. Because I know that that tree, especially the young fruit trees I have, don't have fruit yet. It's going to be years before they get fruit. It's going to be more years until they get so much fruit that I'm reveling in the harvest. I'm growing a lot of cider apple trees. It's probably going to be 7 or 8 years before I'm making cider from my cider apple trees. But you know what? The garden's a time machine. I can see into the future by looking at that fruit tree. I can see me 8 years from now making cider. I already have the spot picked out in my basement where I'm going to do it. The fruit tree takes me into the future and gives me the vision of what the future is going to be. So, what do you think? I think this is just a mind-blowing concept, that if you change the perspective from a time component in your garden, you can look into the past and you can look into the future with every plant that you're growing. Think about your tomatoes, especially if you started your tomatoes from seed. Now you go out to your garden and you see your tomato plants. It takes you back months ago, instantly, to when you were putting those seeds into your potting soil to grow tomatoes. And for all the talk that we've had today about the green tomatoes and what you can do with them, well, now the time machine comes into play as well. When you're looking at your tomato plant and you see those green tomatoes, it takes you into the future. I already know what I'm going to be doing with my ripe tomatoes. I was just talking yesterday with my brother-in-law about a tomato tasting that I'm planning with my tomatoes. So I don't even have any tomatoes yet that I've harvested, but I can already see 6 weeks into the future when we are sitting there side by side, me, family members, and friends, tasting all of these different tomatoes. And I'm going to do a video and share with you the results of that tasting so that we can tell you what we think is the best tasting tomato. It's a time machine. It's taking us to a point of time that doesn't exist right now. And even though it might be a few minutes in the past or a few minutes in the future, that's what gardening is so good for. Think about it. Sit in your garden and you're watching these big black wasps that are on your corn or that are attacking a spider. What's going to happen next? What do you think? Think about it. 1 minute in the future, is that wasp still going to be here? 5 minutes in the future, is that wasp going to be gone? A day in the future, are you going to see the wasp again? I just love that mental exercise. And the reason I put it in the format of mental exercise or a mental problem or a mental adventure, for those of you that know anything about Albert Einstein and some of the other great theorists of history, that's how they viewed the universe, is they would put themselves in a situation and just think, what would happen if this one other thing was a little bit different? What would happen if I changed my perspective? And they create an exercise within their brain. Well, I say do that in your garden. Take a time travel journey in your garden. Be it a couple minutes with an insect, or be it years with some crop that is yet to even exist. But do that. Sit, enjoy your garden, and do some traveling through time into the past. And this is one of those things that I really like doing, where I focus on a plant or I focus on an insect and I think back to when I saw it last or what it was like a month ago. And it doesn't even need to be that same plant. I'll look at a plant that I'm growing now and it'll take me back to gardens of my past, to other houses, to other states, to other completely different environments by just stopping and doing a little time travel into another era that I've already been. And then, of course, I think about the future. What am I going to do next year in my garden? In the spot that I'm growing in right now, that plant that I'm going to remove and put in another seed, what am I going to do next year? Well, it's a time machine. The garden can take you through time, and I encourage you to look at it from a slightly different perspective over the course of the next week and start thinking about how you can use your garden, your plants, your harvests to take you into a time that doesn't exist right now. So I hope your mind is blown just a little bit, because it blows my mind to think about it. And I wanted to share that with you. That's one of the things I enjoy about gardening. It's just, it enables me to live outside this moment and enjoy not only the past, but enjoy a future that hasn't even come yet. I want to thank Craig. Thank you so much for that super chat yet again. And Arena Kim, thank you for that Dancing Peach contribution. I appreciate it so much. I always love this time. It's so wonderful that you're all here. I show that we've got 277 people here. Carrie Ramirez, thank you so much for that contribution. Can you do a video about growing trees in containers? That is on my list. And I've already started thinking about, again, looking into the future. I've already started thinking about what tree I'm going to order next year to grow in a container, and I already have the spot picked out in my garden where I'm going to put that big pot. So yes, that video is coming. It's not going to happen till next year, but it's definitely on the list. So thank you for all of your contributions today. Thank you for all of your interest. Thank you for all of your questions. As always, thank you to those of you that play such an important role to answer the questions that I can't get to as they pop up in the chat. Thank you to everybody. I hope you get out there and start gardening today as soon as this is over, and keep gardening throughout the week, and then share some of your stories with all of us next week. And if you missed anything, go back to this as a replay. In a couple days, we'll have the timestamps in place thanks to the help of my daughter. It's always good to see you on a Monday. I'm always glad that I can help you on your journey to become a better gardener. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.